Well, the Conservative MP and leading Brexiteer Mark Francois joins us from Rayleigh in Essex. Many thanks for joining us this afternoon, Mr Francois. Your views on Brexit are very well documented, but is there anything with 2 days to go that the Prime Minister could do or say that would change your position?
No, and perhaps I could explain to your viewers why. What we will vote on Tuesday is a draft international treaty. This is my well-thumbed copy of it. And that's why it's called the meaningful vote. Will the House of Commons, in principle, approve this treaty or not? Now, because it's a treaty, it is what's called higher law. So it overrides any motion of the House of Commons, and it even overrides an Act of Parliament. And it says specifically in Article 4 of this treaty that if there's a clash between this and an Act of Parliament, this is superior. So if we agree to this, we're bound pretty much forever in international law. And what will probably happen tomorrow is that the EU, on the eve of the vote, after 2.5 years, will miraculously produce a letter which appears to give some guarantees about this treaty and how it would operate, particularly around something called the backstop, which is one of the most controversial, but not the only controversial aspects of the treaty. And the government will trumpet this as a fantastic victory. The problem is it will be legally meaningless. It will not override the treaty, but the government will try and pretend that in some way it does to convince my colleagues that we should vote for it. So what I'm doing here is I'm whistleblowing on the government plan, and the fatal flaw in the plan is that that letter will be a love letter, if you like. It'll be well intended, but legally it will be meaningless.
So if you've seen through them, what happens when the Prime Minister is defeated?
Well, let me just tell you what else I think will happen before Tuesday, and then I'll come on to that. To coincide with this letter, by pure coincidence, tomorrow, a group of ambitious Conservative backbenchers will table an amendment in the House of Commons that is linked to the letter. And the government will then probably try and encourage MPs to vote for this amendment at the last minute. I was the operations officer in the Whip's office a few years ago for 2 years, so I know how they work. And it's sometimes known in Whip's world as a lifeboat amendment. So in other words, you say to your colleagues, look, the ship is sinking, we're in a desperate situation, everybody jump in the lifeboat and that will save us. Except that the lifeboat, if you like, will be full of holes, because the amendment would only be a motion of the House of Commons which does not actually have any real control over this, because it's an international treaty. So we'll get the letter from the EU, we'll probably get the lifeboat amendment. The government want this all appear to as if it's all happened by coincidence, and then the whips will run round all my colleagues at the last moment saying you must jump in the lifeboat and you must vote for the Prime Minister's deal. And our heads don't button up at the back. We've seen this coming, and we're not going to fall for it. And
what about if the European Union was to give more reassurances to members of Parliament with regards to the issue of the backstop? I mean, that would be a game changer, would it not? Because there'd be a lot of MPs who would say, look, you know, we don't like what the Prime Minister is saying, but the European Union has come to us, has given us more reassurances, and that for now would be good enough for us.
No, it's not a game changer, because the letter will in no way override the treaty. It's a con. The only thing that would count, because it's a treaty, because it's international law, the only thing that would matter is if you change the wording of the treaty itself. Just adding a love letter doesn't change the treaty. The only thing in law, and we've had experts crawl all over this for months, the only thing that would matter in law is if you change the treaty, and that won't do that. So nothing really has changed.
So if the Prime Minister's plan is doomed, Mr. Francois, if the Prime Minister's plan is doomed, what happens when it's defeated? What happens next?
Well, I'll come on to that. But the critical thing is
Well,
Here you
if we can come up to it now, so what is critical? We want to know what is going to happen next moving forward. If you're saying that the Prime Minister's plan is doomed and other Brexiteers are saying that, where does the country go to after that?
OK, I do believe it will be defeated. What we want is a free trade agreement called Super Canada, because it's based on an existing EU-Canadian free trade agreement that the EU signed with Canada in 2016. So there is an existing framework that the EU have already previously approved. And
even though we've been told that's not going to happen by the Prime Minister.
Well, but you're saying to me what happens if she loses? What do we do next? So if she loses, her plan is gone. So then we've got to do something else. And what I'm saying is what we want is Super Canada. We are prepared to go for no deal temporarily to get to Super Canada, but no deal is not what we want. That's not our desired outcome. Our desired outcome is Super Canada, because under that we can trade with all the EU like Canada do, but we're not in the single market, we're not in the customs union, so we keep with the Conservative manifesto.
That sounds like a huge gamble, does it not? That sounds like a huge gamble. What happens if we go into no deal by accident?
No, you've asked me very clearly, what should we do? And I'm trying to explain in plain English what we should do. And the other good thing about Super Canada is that we're completely without the influence of the ECJ. So we will genuinely have left the European Union. We will have honoured the referendum that 17.4 million people voted for. We as MPs will have kept our word to the British people, and that is far better than going for this despicable stitch-up between the EU and the government, which they're going to try and parade tomorrow as a great victory, when in fact it's a capitulation.
So in order to get this Super Canada-style deal, we go into no deal on a temporary basis. Essentially, that's what you're saying?
Yes, and
what happens if the European Union doesn't budge on that, and then it is no deal?
Just, if you give me a chance to explain, I'll do my best. A lot of the work on this free trade agreement has already been done in DEXU. When David Davis was the Secretary of State, they spent 2 years working up a legal text akin to Super Canada. And that's what he planned to give the Cabinet at Chequers. But the white papers were switched at the last minute. David Davis's plan was dropped, and instead we had a plan drawn up by Ollie Robbins and very pro-EU civil servants in number 10 in the Cabinet Office who don't want us to leave the EU. And this means we don't. We remain basically half in and half out. So the white papers were switched at the last minute and the Cabinet were bounced. They weren't allowed to look at both options, debate the merits, and then choose which one they thought was best. The whole thing was a stitch-up. The Super Canada type plan was dropped because the civil servants didn't want it. And they came up with Chequers, which is essentially what this derives from. So the British people were conned. They were completely conned. And there is a way out of this dilemma, and it's called Super Canada. And Donald Tusk and even Michael Barnier are on the record as saying they would favour a comprehensive free trade arrangement with the United Kingdom. So even these key people in the EU have said in principle they would favour something like this. That is the way out of the dilemma.
If the Prime Minister loses on Tuesday, which is the expectation at the moment, is she the right person to continue the negotiations?
Well, let's see what the margin of defeat is. I believe the government will lose. I think the only question is, by how many? If she's overwhelmingly defeated, then I think it's difficult to go back to the EU and then come back to the Commons and they say sort of one more heave, we'll get it over the try line. If it's clear that the House of Commons completely rejects the whole concept of this, then we obviously need to do something else. And I believe that a free trade agreement between ourselves and the EU, allowing us to trade for the mutual benefit of both parties, because we're historically free traders as a nation, would be the way out of this problem. And we will be laying out in the next few days exactly how that would work in practice.
OK, Mark, Francois, we'll just have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.